Hey everyone, so I wanted to do another video here, and the focus is going to be on strategic therapy and solution-focused brief therapy. These are both orientations that focus on the here and now. Very little, if we're being honest, no connection to our past or the origin of feelings or where things come from whatsoever. It's meant to be what is happening now and how do we target and approach that. And both theories are in line with that. Both theories also have couples as their primary theorists who are pushing this forward. And they're very similar in that they sort of offshoot from family systems approach and sort of um, solution focused brief is much more individually focused, but it's still of that era where we're looking into the sort of how do we deal with problems in the moment, based on our understanding of the system and based on our understanding of how these different forces interact with each other. So I'll start with talking about strategic theory and then we'll talk solution focused brief. So strategic theory, the primary theorists were Jay Haley and Chloe Madonas. Jay Haley is going to come up again when we talk about family systems theory. Structural family therapy was created by Salvador Minuchin, and Jay Haley had a lot of influence in that too. They were colleagues. The thing was that Minuchin believed more in the idea that families exist within structures, and Haley felt that the focus needed to be more on our interventions and our strategy and how we approach the family dynamic. And so they sort of diverged, but the theories are very similar. So again, when we talk about structural family therapy and family systems orientation broadly, I'll still give a nod to Haley on that because he was fairly instrumental, but he moved off into this more solution focused family approach, strategic theory, sometimes called strategic family therapy. Um, that's how I've heard it for sure. But the focus then is on making change in the moment. It's meant to be brief. This is not meant to be something that we do over the course of years. It's the one shift that I think is important to note is in many of our orientations, we focus on the counselor is not the expert. The family or the individual is the expert. But in this case, strategic therapy really identifies that the therapist is the expert who's designing and directing different interventions to use with the family. So it's much more active in that sense. It is a problem-solving approach. The goal is to figure out what the problems are and then target them specifically and try to deal with them. Um, I said present, here, and now focused. Some of the techniques that are utilized in this approach are so the counselor will hear a lot about what's going on and then try to identify what is going to be, most important to target. And then they will give directives, which are homework essentially for the family to try to do outside of the session to see if things work. You could do this with an individual. This is not something that needs to be done with a family. It's my belief, though the marriage and family therapy folks would disagree with me, but it's my belief that family therapy techniques and orientations can help inform our work with our individuals because they're still acting as though they're part of a system whether they're in the system or not. We just maybe need to do a little bit more work or maybe a little bit more assessment to understand what's going on. But anyway, the other thing that the orientation will focus on not just on homework, but the therapist may instruct the client to engage in problematic behavior um, in the moment so that this can then disrupt the involuntary nature of the symptoms. So if we tell them exactly how we want them to behave and to behave in that way, when the symptoms aren't there, it can kind of interrupt that because now we're pairing the inappropriate behavior with sort of contextually inappropriate linkages, if that makes sense. Um, I had a colleague who used to instruct families that when they were arguing about something, they were to kind of take note of what it is that they wanted to say. Um, what it is that they wanted to get their point across. Not argue then, stop, separate from each other, and then set their alarms for like 2 in the morning. And if they could wake up and have that conversation then the points must have been relevant enough. But if not, then it must not be helpful. So anyway, reframing techniques and restructuring techniques are another set of interventions. I'll talk about these again much more heavily with structural family therapy. I'm a little bit biased. That's my orientation if I'm doing any family work, but I think they focus on it a little bit better. I feel like these were things that Haley kind of borrowed out of the structural camp and sort of kept. Um, Reframing is essentially taking the problem and painting it in a different way so that it looks contextually different than the problem is being felt. So one of the ways to reframe a family dynamic, say like a child, a problem child, is to point those behaviors towards the child trying to seek help. They know something's wrong, they don't know how to fix it, so they act out. And so then the child becomes more of a hero than, and I'm grossly under exaggerating this. Um, the child becomes more of a hero and is able to be seen differently. That's a reframe. Restructuring is shifting the hierarchy and everything. And again, I think that's more of a structural family therapy orientation, but it is still listed as one of the strategic therapy interventions. Um, so there's a couple different prominent models. Haley and Madonna's have sort of the overarching central clinical model. Um, Big focus on power struggles, family hierarchies, directive behavioral change, all that sort of stuff. There is an MRI model, the Mental Research Institute. They did a lot more with interactions, and then I'm not as familiar with them. I knew the Haley Madonna's model, and then this other one, the Milan systemic model, which was developed in a think tank in Italy off of Haley and Madonna's stuff. There was a lot more focus on addressing family belief patterns, things like that, that were in the Milan model. And when I was doing my structural family therapy training, we did touch upon Milan approach a couple of times. So that's strategic therapy. I know I mentioned structure a lot in that, but it is definitely an offshoot of structural family therapy. That's strategic therapy though. And so it was being developed in a similar time frame to structural family therapy or solution focused brief, I'm sorry. Solution focused brief therapy. The focus of like around this time in our history, the focus became much more about how do we make change in the moment because insurance companies were driving treatment in a lot of ways by approving or denying our services. And so the mental health approach was to not acquiesce to that, but to try to create models that would fit within that structure. And so solution focused brief therapy was a direct sort of a direct answer to this process where we don't know if the client is going to come back. And this is something that you'll experience for sure in your career. You'll have a session with a client, you'll feel like it went really well, and then you'll schedule for the next session, and then they ghost you. Doesn't mean you did anything wrong. It's just they weren't ready for this process, or that was enough for them, or things have changed, or whatever the case may be. But with that in mind, the solution focused brief theorists felt that we needed to make change every session. Every session, something had to be done in order to um, help move the client forward because we don't know if they'll come back. We don't know if we'll have them, experience anything with them again. The two primary theorists associated with solution focused brief, though this is still a very active model, there are still a couple of theorists out there who are very active in their writing and sort of carving this niche out for themselves. I can see one of them, and I can't think of his name off the top of my head, but he's done a lot of branding for himself. Anyway, the two main theorists are Steve DeShazer and more so his wife, Insoo Kim Berg. Insoo Kim Berg is, I don't know which came first, but Insoo Kim Berg is definitely in my mind, the more primary theorist, and Steve DeShazer, her husband, was very much involved, very much in practice, all of that sort of stuff. But her legacy has more so been sealed with this, I think. Strength-based approach, very future oriented. So like we're not focused at all on the past, what is happening now and what do we want to get to? In that way, it's goal directed, goal oriented. So the client shares their problems, we help them to build solutions. That's it. We don't dwell on problems. The whole model is meant to be, um, if done correctly, from the perspective of these theorists, is meant to last on average 5 to 8 sessions total. Again, it fits within this structure of client comes in, we address things, we discharge, they move on. Um, some of the principles are sort of associated with, so again, I said strength based, but change being constant. So even in the moment, people are changing. Um, Thus, the problem is going to be very different a few months from now than it is, um, in this moment. So we need to work with it now in its current structure because it's going to change. So we may as well help change it into something useful. In this case, the client is seen as the expert. The client defines the problem, their goals, desired outcomes, all that sort of stuff. It's meant to be very collaborative. Um, and again, the focus is on the future. So, where do you want to be, and how do we get you there? And I like that about. I don't do much solution focused brief work because I do focus a lot on the history and how we got here and all of that. That's just how I think about things. But I love some of their interventions, and so I've definitely incorporated their interventions into my work. Some of the primary interventions that are used are so exception finding questions. So the client will talk about all the times where this problem is happening. It's our job then to find out when it's not happening because there's something that is occurring in those moments. And maybe it's just like, as I think about a couple dynamic, they're not arguing when they're not together. That's a clue, you know? So exception finding questions. So when is the problem not there? When is it less severe? All of that sort of stuff. The miracle question is something that I'll want to focus some time on. I certainly talk about it more in my advanced theories classes, but the idea of saying to the client, so this problem, whatever it is, let's identify it. Now, it's not there anymore. So a miracle happens overnight. You go to sleep. You don't know that it happened because you were asleep, but a miracle happens and the problem isn't here anymore. What's the first thing you notice when you wake up in the morning that lets you know that the problem is not there? Um, and clients will do big, lofty things like, well, I'll know that, my bank account is full. I'll have millions of dollars in my bank account and the problem won't be there. Okay, sure. That would probably get rid of your problems. But you don't know, like I don't know about you, but the first thing I do in the morning with my various senses is not check my bank account. Maybe if I'm worried about something, but typically no. So that's not a good indicator. Let's go deeper. Open your eyes. What do you notice that's different in your morning? So that's the miracle question. It requires a lot of setup and it requires some support because clients will naturally gravitate to these bigger things. We want to get them to small changes so that we can say like, oh, okay, so you would smell coffee brewing in the morning. You'd know that your partner got up ahead of you and put the coffee on. Can you do that for them so that maybe they could experience this one time in the next week before we get back together? And then that becomes, we're building the change as we go. Validate when things, so compliments, validating and highlighting when things are good. This is an interesting intervention for me. Formula first session task. It's clients observe what happens in their lives that they want to continue. So like what is going well and let's try to do more of that. Um, Scaling questions are one of my favorite. This is so the miracle question is one I use frequently. Scaling questions is something that I use all the time. It's so on a scale from 1 to 10 or a scale from 0 to 10. I prefer 1 to 10. I just find people gravitate to it easier. Zero sounds like I don't know. So on a scale from 1 to 10, where one is the problem is never happening, to two is it's happening all the time, or to 10, it's happening all the time. Where are you at on this scale? And so if they say, well, I'm at a 6, okay, so it's happening a lot. What does a six look like? Let's talk about the details of that. What is it going to mean when we get to a seven? What's that going to look like? Okay, so you're at a six. What would it what would we have to do to get you down to say a four on the scale? So it's creating sort of this tangible structure of things that we can observe and note about the situation that's going on, and then we can manipulate the scale to try to see what our warning signs are or see how we might reduce the severity of whatever is going on. It's important to give the scale. You can also say 1 to 5. It doesn't really matter. Don't go above 10. I've had supervisors who've like a scale from 1 to 50 doesn't matter. The more points you put, the more difficult it's going to be to assess this scale. And also, clients will naturally want to not commit to something. So, like, even on a scale from 1 to 5, I'll get clients who say, I'm at a like 3.5. Just give me a number. It's what it means to you. So, don't give too many numbers. It's not actually helpful. But so, on a scale from 1 to 10, where one is you're not experiencing any joy, and 10 is you're experiencing, you know, fantastic, wonderful joy throughout your life in every way. Where are you at? And what's it? You can make the scale, where one is good and 10 is bad, or one is bad and 10 is good. It doesn't matter. Give the scale. So on a scale from 1 to 10, where one is this and 10 is this, where are you at? So define the parameters and give it. But anyway, solution focused brief theory is very much here and now, very much change in the moment. But again, no history in either of these theories. It doesn't matter how we got here. It's what are we dealing with now and how do we want to get to the next steps. Hopefully, this was helpful for you, and I'm going to look forward to chatting more about it.